Tokyo in 1941 did not feel like a city preparing to burn. It felt like a city trying to pretend it would never have to. The neon still glowed in narrow streets. The paper screens still softened lamplight into something domestic. In the hotel bars where foreign correspondents drank too much and spoke too loudly, the air smelled of tobacco, cologne, and the quiet confidence of people who believed they had time. Richard Sorge made himself part of that confidence. He did it with the kind of ease that looks like charm until you realize it is calculation. He was a German journalist, respected enough to be invited, sloppy enough to be forgiven, and connected enough to drift through rooms where careful men should not have drifted. He laughed too loudly, drank too deeply, and used that performance like a shield. When a man behaves like a harmless mess, people stop counting what he hears. In Tokyo, he wore his cover like a second skin. He cultivated the embassy, the press circles, the intellectual salons, and the late-night conversations that began as gossip and ended as policy. He spoke as if he belonged to the German world, because officially he did. He was close to Ambassador Huguenot, close enough that friendship blurred into access. He could walk into spaces where documents lay unguarded, not because anyone was careless, but because they assumed he was one of us. That assumption was the first miracle of the Sorge Ring. Not technology, not codes, not radios, just human certainty. Japan watched foreign communities closely. It had counterintelligence organs trained to distrust. It was a country where a casual question could be remembered for months. Yet Sorge moved with the strange freedom of a man who had engineered his own invisibility. He joined the Nazi Party. He leaned into the German identity. He played the role of the loyal German observer so thoroughly that even those who distrusted foreigners assumed, at worst, that he was Berlin's problem, not Tokyo's. And beneath the performance, he ran a network. It was not glamorous in the way later spy fiction would demand. It was a machine built from ordinary human weaknesses: pride, ideology, loneliness, ambition. His closest Japanese source was not a shadowy assassin or a trained saboteur. It was a man inside the bloodstream of Japanese political thinking, Hotsumi Ozaki, a journalist and intellectual with access to decision-making circles, a listener in rooms where men spoke as if history could be steered by willpower alone. Ozaki delivered what Tokyo never imagined a foreign agent could steal. Not just secrets, but intentions. Intentions are the rarest intelligence because they live before paper. Plans can change, documents can be forged, orders can be delayed. But when a government decides in principle what it will do, north, south, war, negotiation, that decision leaves a fingerprint long before it leaves a trail. Sorge's ring was built to collect fingerprints. He had a radio operator too, Max Clausen, because without transmission, even perfect intelligence dies in the drawer. Tokyo could be watched, but Moscow had to be fed. And feeding Moscow meant radio. It meant bursts of messages into the night air, enciphered and timed, confident the distance itself was protection. Japan did not fear radios in the abstract. It feared what a radio could do in a capital full of military secrets. But Sorge's transmissions did not look like a normal spy's panic. They were systematic. They used one-time pads, gibberish even if intercepted, so that a Japanese monitor could hear the signal and still learn nothing. That, too, was part of why Japan struggled to believe what it was seeing. A spy ring is one thing, a ring that operates with discipline, patience, and technical competence inside Tokyo felt like an insult. And then there was the timing. In 1941, Japan stood at a crossroads with its own logic. The empire had expanded into China and bled into stalemate. The United States tightened economic pressure, especially oil. The Japanese leadership debated direction: strike north against the Soviet Union, or strike south for resources in Southeast Asia. The argument was not just strategic, it was emotional. North was vengeance and rivalry. South was survival and gamble. Sorge listened to those debates as if he were listening to thunder in the distance, trying to estimate exactly where the storm would break. At the same time, he watched Germany's posture with the cold clarity of a man who knew Berlin's ambitions could become Moscow's death sentence. His position in Tokyo gave him access to German diplomatic chatter and military assumptions. He could see Germany's confidence in its own coming campaign against the Soviet Union. He could see the way some German officers treated invasion as a calendar event, something already decided, only waiting for the right morning. If you want to understand why Japan couldn't believe the radio spy, you have to understand what belief would have required. It would have required Japanese counterintelligence to accept that a man who looked German, acted German, and was welcomed by the German embassy was actually serving Moscow, and that the most valuable Japanese information was being carried out not by a stolen briefcase, but by a trusted conversation. That is the hardest kind of espionage to accept, because it means your security failed at the level of human judgment, not locks. The Sorge ring did not operate like a burglary. It operated like a dinner party. By mid-1941, the air in Tokyo changed. Negotiations with the United States grew sharper, and the military factions in Japan grew less patient with talk. In Europe, Germany moved from threat to action. The Soviet Union, bound to Japan by a neutrality pact, still watched Japan's armies in Manchuria with a constant tension that never quite became relief. Moscow's nightmare was simple: a two-front war, Germany from the west, Japan from the east. Sorge's job, at its core, was to answer one question for Moscow: will Japan strike? He built his answer from many smaller ones: cabinet mood, imperial conferences, army planning in Manchuria, the weight of North doctrine, the pull of South resources. When he transmitted more than facts. He transmitted an image of Tokyo's mind. And in that mind, he began to see a decision forming: Japan leaning south, toward the Pacific, toward Southeast Asia, toward the kind of war that would require boldness and would reward surprise. If that decision hardened, Moscow could move troops from Siberia westward. If that decision was wrong, Moscow could lose everything. This is what made Sorge dangerous. Not that he stole secrets, but that his intelligence could change the shape of entire campaigns. A single confident assessment about Japan's intentions could release divisions, tanks, aircraft, thousands of men from the Far East to the gates of Moscow. For Japan, the idea that such a lever existed inside Tokyo, hidden behind a loud German journalist with too many lovers and too much alcohol, was not only shocking, it was unbearable. And yet, even as Sorge's intelligence grew more valuable, his risk grew more ordinary. A ring is rarely broken by a dramatic chase. It is broken by fatigue, by a loose tongue, by an arrest that begins in the wrong place and then spreads like fire through names and connections. In Tokyo, the fire was about to start, and when it did, the people hunting it would not begin with Sorge. They would begin with someone smaller, easier and more frightened, someone who could be pushed until he pointed. Sorge's greatest advantage was also his greatest curse. He knew too much too early. In the months before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the air around the German embassy in Tokyo carried a certain kind of arrogance, soft, confident, and fatal. Officers spoke as if the campaign in the East was already written, as if Soviet resistance was a problem of distance rather than will. In casual conversations, dates appeared the way dates appear in a man's diary, not in a strategist's caution. Sorge listened. He smiled. He drank. He asked questions that sounded like curiosity. He filed away answers that sounded like gossip. And then, when he was alone, he turned those answers into messages that could shake Moscow. He warned that Germany was coming. For a spy, warning is the purest form of intelligence and the most difficult to prove. It has no photograph, no captured document. It is a claim about tomorrow. Tomorrow that could still change if some unseen hand decides to delay. But as 1941 tightened, Sorge's sources hardened. Berlin was not bluffing. The invasion was not rumor. It was preparation. So he transmitted. He did not write like a novelist. He wrote like a man who understood that his value lived in credibility. He referenced who had said what and where the information came from. He gave timelines, he gave context. He gave what he could without revealing the delicate web of relationships he relied on. And in Moscow, men read his messages and hesitated. Stalin's Soviet Union had been flooded with warnings from many directions. Some were true, some were false, some were planted. Stalin's paranoia was not created from nothing. It was fed by a decade of internal betrayal, external manipulation, and the terror of making the wrong move too early. If Stalin mobilized openly and Hitler delayed, the Soviets could be accused of provocation. If Stalin believed every warning, he would tear his own state apart in panic. So Stalin chose the most dangerous compromise: skepticism. Sorge, far away in Tokyo, could not see the faces reading his reports, but he could feel the silence. The radio gave him no comfort. There is no applause in espionage, only the faint knowledge that a signal was sent and the hope that someone serious is listening. Then Germany invaded on June 22, 1941, and the world snapped into a new shape. Tokyo reacted in its own cautious way. Japan had a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, and Japan had unfinished business in China and a tightening vice from the United States. Japan's leaders watched Germany's opening blows with calculation, not loyalty. The northbound option, attacking Siberia, was still discussed, still imagined, still desired by some factions, but it was not decided. This is where Sorge's role became uniquely terrifying. He was positioned at the intersection of two empires' private thoughts: Germany's confidence and Japan's hesitation. He could see that Japan's hesitation might become Moscow's survival. He could see that if Japan stayed south, the Soviet Far East could be thinned, and troops could be sent west. And he could see that if Japan struck north, the Soviet Union might collapse between two jaws. So he began to focus almost entirely on Japan's intention. The questions were simple, but answering them required intimacy with power. What did the Army General Staff want? What did the Navy insist on? How did cabinet politics shift the balance? What did the imperial conferences reveal about the true decision? Was the Kwantung Army preparing to move, or merely posturing? Was Kantokwan, the grand plan for northern operations, alive or becoming a ghost? Ozaki became the artery of that intelligence. He listened to conversations near the top. He heard what men said when they believed the room was safe. And he fed Sorge not headlines, but the shape of deliberation, the pressure points, the bargaining, the mood. Sorge's transmissions to Moscow began to carry a different kind of certainty. Not certainty about tanks and divisions, but certainty about direction. Japan was leaning south. Japan was looking towards Southeast Asia. Japan was calculating that war with the United States might be unavoidable, and that resources, especially oil, would decide whether Japan lived or died. To Moscow, that direction was not merely interesting, it was life. If Japan struck south, the Soviet Union could shift forces westward. If Japan struck north, Moscow would have to keep its Far Eastern armies pinned in place. The difference was not a footnote. It was the difference between holding Moscow and losing it. Sorge did what spies are rarely asked to do. He staked his reputation on a judgment call. He indicated that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in 1941 unless unlikely conditions were met. Conditions that implied the Soviet Union would already be in ruins. In other words, Japan would wait. Japan would strike south first. That assessment, if trusted, could unlock the Siberian divisions. In the West, the war's story is often told in the language of battles. In the Soviet story, the Siberian divisions became legend. Fresh troops, winter-hardened, arriving at the moment Moscow needed strength. The truth is more complex, and intelligence rarely acts alone. Codes were broken, other sources existed. But Sorge's reporting became part of the confidence that allowed a gamble. And in war, confidence is sometimes as decisive as armor. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Sorge maintained the mask. He drank with Germans. He joked. He moved through the embassy. He lived publicly enough that privacy seemed unnecessary, and that public life became its own camouflage. But espionage has a way of turning routine into danger. Every transmission is a risk. Every meeting is a risk. Every human being is a risk. And in a tight city like Tokyo, where police could watch the same doorway for weeks, risk accumulates invisibly until the day it becomes unavoidable. Sorge's ring had been operating for years. That longevity can create a sense of invincibility. It can also create fatigue. People begin to believe that what has worked will keep working. They begin to relax the discipline that made the work possible. Japan's counterintelligence did not need to catch the radio spy at the radio. It only needed one crack. One small arrest that produced one name that produced another. The tragedy of espionage is that the great work and the great collapse often sit side by side. Sorge could send the message that freed divisions for Moscow and still be undone by a thread pulled from a minor contact. In 1941, Tokyo's police began pulling threads. And once the threads started moving, the ring's secrets would begin to unravel. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a chain of interrogations, confessions, and quiet terror that spread faster than any radio signal. In Tokyo, decisions did not arrive like thunder. They arrived like pressure behind a sealed door. Men in uniform and men in suits argued about maps as if maps could create oil, as if arrows could manufacture steel, as if national spirit could replace the fuel gauges of ships and aircraft. Japan's strategic dilemma in 1941 was brutally physical. The empire needed resources, and the United States was tightening a grip that made time feel like an enemy. Every week of negotiation without resolution felt like another week closer to immobility. The army looked north with old instinct. The Soviet Union was a rival, Siberia a temptation, and the memory of border clashes still lived in institutional pride. But the army also knew reality. To strike north would mean war with a massive land power, while Japan was already bleeding in China. The Navy looked south because the sea carried the resources Japan needed: oil, rubber, raw materials, and because the Navy understood the logic of a sudden blow. A fleet could gamble on surprise. A fleet could do in days what armies might grind out in months. The Navy also understood a darker truth. If Japan struck south, war with the United States was not a possibility. It was the price. Sorge watched this pressure build through Ozaki's access and through his own ability to read the mood of foreign embassies. German diplomats wanted Japan to strike north and open a second front against the Soviet Union. Berlin's hopes were simple. If Japan attacked Siberia, the Soviet Union would collapse faster, Germany would win in the east, and the war would shift in Germany's favor. But Tokyo's hopes were not Berlin's hopes. Tokyo's crisis was not ideology, it was fuel. Sorge's ring existed to extract that divergence and deliver it to Moscow. As the summer of 1941 passed, the pattern became clearer. Japanese deliberations hardened around southward expansion. Imperial conferences, those rare moments when Japan's highest policy was formalized, pushed the logic toward a confrontation path. Negotiations with the United States continued, but the mood behind them was increasingly fatalistic. Tokyo was not asking whether it would fight. It was asking how to choose the battlefield. For Moscow, this mattered more than any headline about speeches or propaganda. If Japan was committed to striking south, then the Soviet Far East was no longer an immediate battlefield. That meant Siberian divisions could move west. That meant Moscow could stiffen its defense while Germany's armies surged forward. Sorge transmitted his assessment with a weight that was almost moral. He was telling Moscow, Japan will not strike you now. Japan is looking elsewhere. Japan is preparing for a different war. And if Moscow believed him, men would live or die based on that belief. The most misunderstood part of intelligence work is that it does not create certainty. It creates permission. It gives leaders a reason to choose one risk over another. Stalin's Soviet Union was drowning in risk. Germany was crushing westward. Cities fell. Armies were encircled. In such a moment, moving divisions from the Far East could look like madness, unless you believed the East would remain quiet. Sorge's reporting, combined with other sources, helped build that belief. It built the permission to move. In the months that followed, trains carried troops westward, divisions that would later be remembered as Siberian, winter-trained, disciplined, hardened. Whether Sorge alone saved Moscow is a myth too clean to trust, but the truth remains. He delivered a key piece of confidence at the exact time confidence was the rarest resource in Moscow. Tokyo, meanwhile, was moving toward its own irreversible choice. It is tempting to imagine Japanese leaders in 1941 as a single mind, but they were not. They were factions. They were rivalries. They were men protecting their service's prestige. They were planners trying to reconcile ambition with reality. And the closer Japan drifted toward war with the United States, the more urgent secrecy became. That secrecy tightened the city. Police watched more carefully. Military men grew more suspicious. Foreigners were not just curiosities. They were potential channels of influence. A city preparing to strike does not like to imagine that its intentions are being broadcast. And yet the irony of Tokyo was that it was too crowded, too alive, too filled with conversations to be fully sealed. People still spoke. People still trusted. People still desired recognition. And spies like Sorge learned to treat trust as a resource to be harvested. The Japanese authorities did not catch Sorge because they suddenly became brilliant. They caught him because the ring touched too many lives. Somewhere in the chain, a minor contact began to bend under pressure. Reports suggest that the first real crack came not from Sorge himself, but from the Japanese side of the network. Individuals who were vulnerable to surveillance, to interrogation, to panic. One arrest led to another. A name spoken in fear became a door kicked open. A confession became a map. This is the part of the story where the myth often tries to become cinematic, a raid, a chase, a dramatic capture. The reality was quieter. It was bureaucracy, interrogation, and human pain. When Japanese counterintelligence began to suspect an espionage ring, the radio signals were an obvious focus, but the signals were unreadable. They sounded like noise. That forced Japanese investigators toward the only method that works when technology fails. Find the people. They pulled on the weakest thread. They interrogated. They threatened. They made the cost of silence feel heavier than betrayal. And slowly, the ring's outline emerged. By October 1941, the dragnet tightened. Arrests spread. The number would eventually grow large. Dozens pulled into the case. Tokyo had uncovered not just a foreign spy, but a network that included Japanese citizens, an embarrassment that cut deeper than any foreign intrusion. Foreign espionage could be framed as an external threat. Domestic collaboration forced Japan to confront internal fracture. When Sorge was arrested in Tokyo on October 18, 1941, it shocked even those who knew him well. The German ambassador Ott, by most accounts, was stunned, angered, disbelieving, convinced it was hysteria or mistake. To Ott, Sorge was a friend and a trusted German. If Tokyo had arrested him, Ott assumed it must be for something minor. Maybe careless talk, maybe embassy secrets, maybe an overreach by Japanese police. The deeper truth, that Sorge was a Soviet agent, was almost too humiliating to accept at first, even for Berlin. For Japan, the arrest did not immediately settle the question of who Sorge truly served. That is another reason Japan couldn't believe the radio spy. Sorge's cover was so strong that even after capture, the initial assumption could be that he was working for German intelligence, not Moscow. Japan's investigators had to force the truth out, and truth under interrogation is always complicated. Part confession, part survival, part bargaining. Sorge resisted at first, then eventually confessed under pressure. The Soviet Union, as states often do, denied him. Moscow treated him as if he did not exist. Japan held him in Sugamo prison. And outside the prison walls, history moved fast. Within weeks, Japan would strike the South into the Pacific, dragging the United States into the war. In the West, the Soviet Union would fight for its existence. Sorge, who had helped shape a strategic confidence in Moscow, would be locked in a cell in Tokyo, listening as the world he had influenced spun onward without him. The cruelest irony of espionage is that success is often followed immediately by abandonment. And Richard Sorge's story was about to become not only a tale of intelligence, but a tale of betrayal by the very state he served. Sugamo prison was not built to be cinematic. It was built to make men small. Cells, corridors, locked doors, the disciplined routine of a state that believes confinement is proof of authority. In such places, time becomes its own weapon. Days blur. Meals arrive with mechanical indifference. A prisoner's identity begins to fray at the edges, not because he forgets who he is, but because he learns how little it matters to anyone outside. Sorge entered that world in October 1941 with something most prisoners do not possess, an understanding of how large the war truly was. He knew he was not a minor capture. He knew Japan had not simply arrested a man. It had arrested a story that could shame governments and reorder reputations. Japan's investigators did not begin with the assumption that Sorge was a Soviet agent. His cover had been built too well. His association with the German embassy and his Nazi Party membership created a first, more comfortable narrative. Perhaps he was an Abwehr spy. Perhaps he was feeding Berlin information about Japan's negotiations with the United States. Perhaps he was simply too curious for his own safety. That narrative allowed Japan to believe the problem was manageable, a foreign intelligence nuisance, not a humiliating penetration by Moscow. But the evidence pulled the investigators in the other direction. They found the radio operations. They found the connections. They found that Japanese citizens had been involved, including Ozaki, and that involvement changed the emotional temperature of the case. A Japanese collaborator is not merely a suspect. He is a symbol of internal vulnerability. Once Ozaki's name appeared, the case stopped being a foreign spy story and became a domestic wound. Interrogation in wartime Japan was not gentle. The empire took internal security seriously, and it understood that espionage was not only theft of secrets, it was the infection of loyalty. Sorge resisted at first because resistance is what professionals do when the early hours still contain hope. But hope dies quickly in a system designed to stretch pain and uncertainty until confession feels like relief. Eventually, Sorge confessed. The details of how and why a man confesses are always tangled. Some confess because they break. Some confess because they bargain. Some confess because they believe they can shape the outcome. Sorge's confession appears to have carried an unusual condition. He sought protection for people he cared about, his Japanese lover and the wives of colleagues, insisting they were innocent. It was an odd moment of human softness inside a machinery of state violence. Japan tried him and convicted him as a communist agent whose activities threatened the emperor's system. It is important to notice that language. The charge was not merely espionage, it was ideological subversion. Japan needed the case to be framed as an internal defense, not a mere embarrassment. A spy ring becomes easier to justify when it is described as an attack on the state's very foundation. Sorge, however, believed he still had value. He believed he could be traded. States often exchange prisoners. Even in wartime, pragmatism can win over pride. Sorge assumed Moscow would not abandon an asset of his magnitude. He assumed, like many intelligence men, that the state that uses you will at least recognize the usefulness of keeping you alive. Japan also saw the logic. A prisoner exchange could bring back Japanese personnel from the Soviet side. It could close the matter quietly. It could avoid the public spectacle of executing a foreigner connected to embassies and diplomatic headaches. So Japan explored exchange possibilities, and Moscow refused. Not with an argument, not with negotiation, but with denial. The Soviet Union treated Sorge as unknown. The line was cold and bureaucratic, as if the man had never existed. It was not only abandonment, it was erasure. From Moscow's perspective, this was a familiar cruelty. States rarely acknowledge spies because acknowledgement reveals methods and embarrasses leaders. In Sorge's case, there was another reason. He was a living reminder that Stalin had ignored warnings before the German invasion. To accept Sorge publicly would be to admit that warnings had existed and that they had been dismissed. In a regime built on the myth of infallible leadership, that admission was dangerous. So Sorge waited in Sugamo with the knowledge that his greatest success had become his greatest liability. Outside, the war expanded. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and plunged the Pacific into fire. Germany drove deeper into the Soviet Union. Moscow fought for survival. The intelligence world reshaped itself, new alliances formed, and old assumptions collapsed. In this storm, Sorge was a forgotten man in a cell, useful only as a cautionary example to others. There is a special kind of loneliness in being denied by the state you served. It is not like ordinary betrayal, where another person breaks a promise. It is betrayal with the weight of institutions. It tells you that your life is not a price the state will pay, even if your work helped keep it alive. Sorge's Japanese captors kept him alive for years. He was sentenced to death in 1943, but the sentence did not immediately become action. Japan had reasons to delay. Bureaucracy moves slowly. War creates uncertainty, and perhaps even in Tokyo, there lingered a faint thought that exchange might become possible later, but Moscow's denial removed the incentive. By 1944, Japan's war situation deteriorated. Bombing intensified. Resources thinned. The empire's confidence cracked. In such moments, states become harsher, not softer. They tighten control, punish threats, and perform executions not only as justice, but as ritual, a reminder that the state still holds power over bodies even when it cannot hold power over events. On November 7, 1944, Richard Sorge was executed, hanged at Sugamo prison. On the same day, Ozaki was also executed. The symbolism was sharp. The foreign spy and the domestic collaborator erased together, as if to seal the wound with a single act. Sorge's death was not dramatic in the way a battlefield death can be. It was administrative. It was a rope, a trap door, a report filed after the body stopped moving. Yet the story did not end cleanly. For years, the Soviet Union continued to deny him. Only decades later would the Soviet state publicly honor him, turning him into a hero after it was safe. After Stalin was gone, after the political usefulness of the story changed, Japan too would revisit the case later, as historians tried to separate myth from record. Some claims around Sorge grew into legend. The idea that he predicted every detail, that he single-handedly saved Moscow, that he foresaw Pearl Harbor perfectly. Serious history is less tidy. Intelligence is rarely solitary. Predictions are rarely perfect. But the skeleton of the story remains true and brutal. Sorge was inside Tokyo. He delivered critical reporting on Germany's attack in Japan's policy direction. He was uncovered in October 1941, and he was executed in 1944 after being denied by Moscow. So why couldn't Japan believe him? Because the case forced Japan to accept three humiliations at once. First, that a foreigner who looked like an ally was serving an enemy. Second, that Japanese citizens with access to the state had aided him. And third, that the state's own secrecy, its belief that intentions could be locked away, was broken by something as simple as conversation. In the end, the radio was not the core shock. Radios can be found, antennas can be traced, signals can be monitored. The true shock was that the spy did not arrive through force. He arrived through trust. Sugamo prison swallowed Sorge's body, but it could not swallow that lesson. Because once a state learns that its intentions can leak through the mouths of its own men, it becomes a more fearful state. One that suspects everyone, punishes quickly, and tightens control until the city itself feels like a prison. And Tokyo in the last years of the war would become exactly that. Every great spy story is eventually pulled apart by the needs of nations. Japan needed the Sorge case to prove internal vigilance and punish ideological contamination. The Soviet Union needed the Sorge story to be silent when silence protected leadership, and heroic when heroism became useful. The West needed the story to fit a familiar narrative. One man, one warning, one dramatic impact. The real story sits in the tension between what intelligence can do and what leaders are willing to do with it. Sorge provided warnings about Germany's coming invasion and reporting about Japan's strategic direction. Those are historically grounded. But the claim that Sorge predicted everything the way a prophet does is a myth. Intelligence is not prophecy. Intelligence is a portrait painted in dim light. It can capture the shape of intent, but it cannot force intent to stay still. Even the most famous claim, Sorge's reporting enabling the transfer of Siberian divisions, has layers. Soviet signals, intelligence, and code-breaking played roles. Other agents provided corroboration. Stalin's own political calculations mattered. But the reason Sorge remains central is that he held a rare position. He could see Japan's policy thinking from within through Ozaki's access, and he could translate it into a form Moscow could act upon. That translation matters. Leaders do not act on raw facts alone. They act on narratives that feel coherent. Sorge's narrative was coherent. Japan, under economic pressure and strategic logic, would strike south rather than gamble on Siberia in 1941. That coherence offered Stalin permission to risk. Japan's inability to believe the radio spy is also partly rooted in the nature of Japanese counterintelligence culture at the time. Japan's security services could imagine foreign espionage in the form of agents who looked foreign, acted foreign, and moved like enemies. Sorge did not. He moved like an insider. He embedded himself in a community that Japan assumed was manageable, the German diplomatic circle. Japan also struggled because the rings method was not theft, but access. It did not need to break into ministries if it could be told what ministries were thinking. This is one of the hardest lessons in intelligence. The most protected information is often not a document, it is a decision. And decisions are made by people who talk. Ozaki's role remains one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the case. It shows that ideology can reach into high policy, that intellectuals can become conduits, and that loyalty is not always aligned with citizenship. For Japan, Ozaki was a nightmare because he represented a breach at the top. If a man near the highest circles could be part of a spy ring, then the state's vision of itself, disciplined, unified, spiritually coherent, was threatened. That is why the case was prosecuted not merely as spying, but as a threat to the emperor's system. The state was defending its myth as much as its secrets. Sorge's personal life also contributed to both his success and his legend. He was known as a heavy drinker and a womanizer. He cultivated lovers and friendships. Some historians suggest this sloppy behavior was part of his camouflage. If you appear reckless, people stop searching for discipline. But reckless living also creates risk. More relationships, more witnesses, more chances for something to slip. The truth is likely both. The same traits that made him blend into the expatriate ecosystem also multiplied the points where he could be observed. His collapse began through the ring's fringes, through arrests that cascaded. That is the normal pattern. Rarely does counterintelligence catch the central figure by brilliance. It catches him by pressure applied elsewhere until the center is exposed. Once exposed, Sorge became useful as a symbol. Japan could claim it had defeated an internal threat. The Soviet Union could later claim it had possessed a master spy. Western storytellers could claim espionage had changed history. All three narratives contain truth and distortion. But if you strip away myth, the moral remains sharp. First, intelligence is powerless without belief. Sorge could transmit warning after warning, but if leadership refused to believe, the warning became only a document. Stalin's initial skepticism did not merely risk the Soviet Union, it also condemned Sorge. In an authoritarian system, ignored truth is dangerous because it reveals leadership's vulnerability. And second, espionage is an economy of trust. Sorge's success depended on trust. German trust in him as a loyal insider, Japanese trust in German circles as predictable, Ozaki's trust in Sorge's mission, Clausen's trust in discipline. When trust holds, intelligence flows. When trust breaks, the entire network collapses at once. Third, the state is rarely loyal in return. Sorge served Moscow, but Moscow did not serve him. This is not unusual. It is structural. Spies are valuable precisely because they can be denied. If they could not be denied, they would be less useful. The cost of that utility is personal abandonment. There is also a colder lesson that military historians rarely say out loud. A spy is a weapon like any other, and weapons are not mourned. They are used. Japan's war effort, by late 1944, was collapsing under pressure. Executing Sorge and Ozaki did not change the outcome, but it performed control. It asserted that the state could still decide who lived and died, even as the state lost control of the skies and seas. In that sense, their executions were less about security than about ritual. After the war, memory reshaped the story again. The Soviet Union eventually honored Sorge, awarding him high recognition years later. That was not purely gratitude. It was politics. It allowed the Soviet state to claim competence, to claim foresight, to claim that its intelligence apparatus had been brilliant even if its leadership had sometimes ignored it. It turned a painful contradiction into a usable legend. Japan's later historiography took a different path. Demystification, document analysis, cautious skepticism about the most sensational claims. That, too, is a form of politics, an attempt to understand rather than simply punish, to place the story inside the larger context of wartime security and ideology. So what does this story mean for your audience today? Viewers who love World War II history, tactics, and engineering. It means that wars are not only won by machines and maneuvers, they are also shaped by what leaders believe about the enemy's next move. Sorge's ring mattered because it addressed a strategic hinge. Japan's direction in 1941. North or south, Siberia or the Pacific. That hinge shaped the Soviet ability to concentrate forces. It shaped the rhythm of the Eastern Front. It shaped the global war. And the most unsettling part is how ordinary the mechanism was. Not a superweapon, not a secret aircraft, not a hidden fortress. Just a man with access, a radio in a room, and a state that did not want to admit it could be fooled. That is why the radio spy still feels unreal. Not because it was impossible, but because it was possible through the most human means. Conversation, confidence, underestimation. In Tokyo in 1941, those were enough to change history. There is a certain cruelty in how the war treated men who worked in shadows. It demanded their brilliance, then erased them from the record when brilliance became inconvenient. Sorge lived long enough to see the war's center shift. When he was arrested in October 1941, the world still had the illusion that Japan could contain the conflict. By the time he was executed in November 1944, Tokyo itself was under strain, the empire's position collapsing, and the war no longer looked like strategy. It looked like survival. Inside Sugamo, Sorge had nothing but time, and time is the worst companion for a spy. A soldier can focus on the next task. A pilot can focus on the next mission. A commander can focus on the next decision. A prisoner can only focus on the next hour. And in that hour, memory becomes a weapon turned inward. Sorge had to live with the knowledge that his intelligence had mattered and that it would not save him. He also had to live with a strange historical irony. Japan's own decision to strike south into the Pacific validated the core of his reporting. Tokyo chose the path that reduced pressure on Siberia. Tokyo chose the war that would consume it. Moscow survived long enough to push Germany back, and the strategic hinge Sorge had reported from Tokyo became part of the story of how the global war aligned. Yet Tokyo did not believe him until the state had already broken him. That is the final, brutal logic of counterintelligence. It does not want to believe until belief is forced, because belief is admission, and admission is humiliation. For an empire that valued unity and control, the idea that its intentions had been extracted and transmitted by a foreign friend was almost worse than a battlefield loss. So Japan made the case into a lesson. Punish the ring, punish the domestic collaborators, show that the state still has teeth. Sorge's execution was one of those teeth. The date, November 7, 1944, has a dark symmetry. In the Soviet calendar, it was associated with revolution. In Tokyo, it became a day of elimination. The rope ended the life of a man who had served Soviet power, while Soviet power continued to deny him. The rope also ended Ozaki's life, the Japanese intellectual whose access had made much of the ring's value possible. That detail matters because it underlines what the state truly feared. A foreign spy is a problem. A domestic source near policy is an infection. If you want to make this story resonate for modern viewers, you do it by showing what it felt like in real time. Not as legend, but as pressure. Picture Tokyo in late 1941, a city preparing for war, tightening secrecy, watching foreigners, policing thought. In that city, a German journalist had walked freely. He had been welcomed by German diplomats, treated as harmless by many Japanese, and trusted by insiders who believed conversations were safe. He was not safe. He was listening. That mechanism, trust exploited, was not unique to Japan. Germany suffered the same arrogance in different forms. Germany believed its own plans could remain hidden. Germany believed its allies would move as Berlin wished. Germany believed speed would compensate for risk. Those beliefs shattered across the war. Sorge's story is a smaller mirror of that larger collapse. Nations believing what they want to be true and paying for it when reality refuses. The story also has a moral contrast that your audience responds to: competence versus loyalty. Sorge was competent. That is undeniable. He built access, ran a network, transmitted intelligence under risk, and sustained operations for years in a hostile environment. Many viewers admire competence, especially in wartime narratives. But competence in espionage exists in a morally gray field. Sorge's competence helped the Soviet Union, a state that could be as brutal to its own people as any empire. He served a cause that would later deny him. His intelligence likely helped move troops that saved Moscow, and his death shows how little the state valued him as a human being. That moral tension is the real documentary ending. Not triumph, not romance, not one man saved the world. Just the cold reality that in total war, the people who change outcomes are often discarded. After the execution, The story did not vanish entirely. Some people remembered. Some people kept the memory alive quietly. Over time, the burial and reburial of remains, the later recognition, the films and books, these layers turned Sorge into a symbol. But symbols are rarely faithful. They simplify. Your script should leave viewers with the unsimplified lesson. A state's most dangerous vulnerabilities are often not weapons, but assumptions. Japan assumed the German Circle was safe. Japan assumed loyalty was visible. Japan assumed secrecy could be maintained by policing documents. Sorge bypassed those assumptions with a social life. And the moment Japan finally accepted the truth, it was too late to undo the damage. The Soviet Union had already received the assessments. Stalin had already made choices with that confidence. Japan's direction had already turned south. Even if Japan had arrested Sorge earlier, it is not certain the war would have changed drastically. But the psychological impact would have. Japan would have understood sooner that its internal unity was not absolute, that ideology could penetrate its own elite circles, that foreign influence could be hidden behind friendship. Instead, Japan learned the lesson through humiliation. That humiliation helps explain why, even after arrest, Japan struggled with the narrative. The state needed a story that restored dignity. Sorge was a communist subversive. Sorge's ring was an ideological attack. The empire defeated it. But reality does not care about dignified narratives. Reality cares about outcomes. And the outcome was that the empire's intentions had been read and transmitted. For the viewer, the most haunting image is not the prison rope. It is the earlier image. Sorge at a table, laughing, drinking, listening, while men around him speak freely about policy, as if no one in the room could possibly be carrying it out into the night. That is the moment the radio spy becomes truly unbelievable. Not because radios are mysterious, but because people are predictable. People want to be heard. People want to be respected. People want to feel safe among friends. Sorge built his entire operation on those wants, and he weaponized them. So when you end the story, end it with quiet, not fireworks. Sorge did not die on a battlefield. He died in a prison, denied by Moscow, executed by Tokyo, remembered later by states that found his memory useful. His life becomes a warning about how war treats individuals who serve systems. And it becomes an even sharper warning about how systems collapse when they trust the wrong person. Because in 1941, Japan did not lose a battle in Tokyo. It lost control of its own intentions. And once an enemy knows what you plan to do before you do it, every weapon you hold becomes less certain because certainty itself has already been stolen. That is what Richard Sorge stole. Not paper, but the future. And the future, once transmitted, is impossible to retrieve.